The fluorescent lights of St. Jude's Trauma Center didn't just illuminate. They hummed with a low, predatory buzz that mirrored the tension in Maya's own nerves. It was 3 a.m., the hour when the city's tragedies finally filtered through the double doors in a frantic parade of shattered glass and stilled hearts. Maya moved through the chaos with the economy of a woman who had no energy to waste on a single unnecessary gesture. She lived her life in the margins of exhaustion, her spine a rigid line of defiance against a world that expected her to break. She prided herself on this hardness. It was the only currency she trusted. Every stitch she placed, every double shift she claimed, was a brick in the wall she was building around her mother and her younger sister, Naomi. She didn't want charity. She didn't even want help. In Maya's experience, help was a debt with hidden interest, and she had spent her entire adult life making sure her ledger was clean. She was the provider, the protector, the one who kept the lights on when the rest of the world went dark. Between the intake of a multi-car pileup and the quiet monitoring of a stabilizing gunshot victim, Maya sat in the break room, her eyes stinging from the sanitized air. She pulled her phone from her scrub pocket to check her bank balance. It was a ritual of survival. She braced herself for the usual deficit, but the numbers staring back at her didn't make sense. The rent for their cramped apartment in the Heights, a neighborhood rapidly becoming too expensive for people like them, hadn't increased in 3 years. In fact, the management office had sent a letter last month citing a long-term residency credit she had never applied for. Then there was Naomi. Her sister had come home yesterday, vibrating with a breathless, disbelieving joy, holding an envelope from the university. A private foundation, anonymous, of course, had selected her for a full-ride scholarship covering her final 2 years. "We're just lucky, Maya," Naomi had said, spinning her around the small kitchen. "Finally, the universe is looking out for us." Maya had smiled for her sister, but as she sat in the clinical cold of the hospital, the word luck tasted like copper in her mouth. She didn't believe in the universe's benevolence. She believed in cause and effect. She believed in the sweat of her own brow. Yet, no matter how she did the math, the numbers of her life were being padded by a silent hand. The scholarships, the stagnant rent, even the way the local grocer always seemed to have a surplus of the expensive produce her mother needed for her heart condition. It was a pattern of protection that Maya hadn't authorized. It felt like a breach. Someone was reaching over her wall, touching the people she loved, and doing it so quietly that she couldn't even find a face to scream at. She felt a phantom weight on her shoulders, the unsettling sensation of being watched not with malice, but with a terrifyingly precise care. A buzzer sounded, cutting through her thoughts. A new trauma was arriving. Maya stood, smoothing her navy scrubs and tucking a loose strand of hair back into her disciplined bun. She pushed the unease into the back of her mind, locking it away behind the professional mask. She had a job to do. She would keep working, keep earning, and keep being the shield her family needed. She would be the one to save them, even if it took every ounce of blood she had left. She didn't need a guardian. She didn't need a ghost. But as she stepped back into the frantic light of the ER, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was already standing in someone else's shadow. The basement clinic was a symphony of damp concrete and the sharp, sterile sting of isopropyl alcohol. Maya worked within a tight circle of amber light. The rest of the room surrendered to a thick, suffocating darkness that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the rain hitting the sidewalk above. She didn't have the luxury of a surgical suite or a team of nurses. She had a flickering lamp, a tray of mismatched instruments, and a man whose blood was cooling on her hands. He was broad-shouldered and lean, his body a map of high-velocity impact and narrow escapes. Maya moved with a clinical detachment that had been her armor for years, her fingers dancing between the gauze and the deep, jagged entry wound in his side. Every breath he took was a ragged struggle, a wet, rattling sound that filled the small space. She wasn't supposed to be here. She was supposed to be finishing her shift at St. Jude's, but the man who had intercepted her at the ambulance bay hadn't asked. He had simply shown her a photo of Naomi walking home, the same Naomi she thought was protected by her own vigilance, and pointed toward the black sedan. She began the closure, her movements precise despite the adrenaline coursing through her. The needle pierced the skin with a soft, sickening pop. 1 stitch. 2. The silence was so heavy it felt underwater. As she reached for a fresh sponge to clear the field, the lamp tilted slightly, the light spilling over his upper arm and shoulder. Maya froze. The needle remained suspended in midair, a silver sliver reflecting the amber glow. There, puckered against his tan skin, was a constellation of scars she had seen before. They weren't just wounds, they were signatures. 3 years ago, her father had crawled through their front door, his side shredded by a very specific caliber of lead, whispering about a shadow that had stepped between him and the end. She had spent weeks debriding those exact patterns. To see them mirrored here, on this stranger, felt like the floor had finally dropped out of her carefully constructed reality. This wasn't a coincidence. It was a confession. A sudden, sharp intake of breath shattered the stillness. Before she could pull back, a hand shot out, fingers like iron bands locking around her wrist. Maya's heart slammed against her ribs. Jin's eyes were open, dark, obsidian orbs that seemed to pull the light from the room. They weren't the eyes of a dying man. They were the eyes of a predator who had been forced to ground. He didn't look at the needle or the blood. He looked at her, his gaze carrying an intensity that felt like a physical weight. "You're late," he rasped, the words catching on the metallic tang of his breath. Maya didn't scream. She didn't pull away. The electric tension between them was so thick she could taste it, a live wire of recognition and terror. She looked at his hand on her wrist, a hand that had clearly dealt death, and then back at the scars on his shoulder that had saved her life. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain. His grip didn't loosen, but his thumb brushed against her pulse point, a terrifyingly intimate gesture. "I'm the reason you have a home to go back to, Maya. Finish the stitch." The command was soft, but it carried the authority of a man who had been decided for a long time. Maya looked at the needle, then at the man who had been her family's invisible architect, and realized that the wall she had built to keep the world out had actually been built around him. She lowered her hand, the steel cold against her skin, and began to weave the thread back into the shadow. The morning air was a bruised purple, the rain having subsided into a clinging, miserable mist that smelled of wet asphalt and old secrets. Maya climbed the stairs to her apartment, each step heavy with the phantom pressure of Jin's hand on her wrist. She felt like a stranger in her own skin, a woman whose life had been a meticulously maintained lie. Inside, the quiet was absolute, broken only by the steady, rhythmic breathing of her mother and Naomi behind their bedroom doors. It was the sound of safety, a safety she now realized had been bought and paid for in blood. She didn't go to bed. Instead, she sat at the small kitchen table, the amber light of the street lamp outside casting long, skeletal shadows across her lap. She pulled out a worn plastic accordion folder, the life file, as she called it. It contained every lease agreement, every medical bill, and every letter Naomi had received over the last 36 months. Maya had always been the one to file them, her heart swelling with a grim pride every time she checked off a debt she thought she had conquered. Now, she looked at them with the eyes of a forensic investigator. She started with the rent credit. The letter was on the property management's official letterhead, signed by a Mr. Henderson. She pulled up the company's corporate filing on her laptop, her fingers flying across the keys. The management company was owned by a holding group called Aegis North. She dug deeper, through layers of shell companies and offshore registrations that would have baffled anyone without her relentless, tired focus. Aegis North was funded by an entity called the Silver Bridge Foundation. Maya's pulse quickened. She pulled Naomi's scholarship letter from the folder. At the very bottom, in tiny, elegant font, was the name of the benefactor, the Silver Bridge Foundation. She went back further, to the night 3 years ago when her father had been randomly admitted to a private clinic after the shooting, bypassing the overburdened public ER. The invoices were all marked paid in full. The donor. A private medical trust that shared the same registered address in downtown Seoul as Silver Bridge. It was a closed loop. A perfect, silent circle of protection that had moved her through the world like a piece on a board. "Who are you?" she whispered to the empty kitchen, her voice a jagged edge in the dark. She searched for the board of directors, for names, for a face to attach to the shadow. But the Silver Bridge Foundation was a masterpiece of invisibility. It existed only as a series of wire transfers and legal proxies. It was a ghost with a checkbook. Then she found it. Hidden deep within a digital tax filing from 2 years ago was a single name listed as a temporary executor during a corporate restructuring: Jin Ho Kang. Maya leaned back, the plastic of the chair creaking under her weight. The name was common enough, but the timeline was a serrated blade. The foundation had been established 48 hours after her father's surgery. The rent freezes had begun 60 days later. The watchman hadn't just been a passerby who got lucky. He had been a man who committed his entire existence to a family he was never supposed to know. She looked around the room, the sturdy kitchen table that had been a clearance find, the high-quality heater that had been a gift from the landlord during a bitter winter. Everything she touched felt radioactive with his presence. She hadn't been the architect of this life. She had been the tenant of a man who lived in a basement with a bullet wound in his side. The pride that had sustained her for years, the belief that she had handled it all, began to dissolve into a terrifying, hollow vulnerability. She wasn't the shield. She was the one being shielded. And as the sun began to bleed through the mist, Maya realized that the most dangerous thing about a ghost isn't that they haunt you, but that they make you love the house they've built for you. The rain returned with a vengeance, drumming against the basement's high, narrow windows like 1,000 impatient fingers. Inside, the air was stagnant, heavy with the scent of iron and the low hum of the portable heater Maya had brought from home. A heater, she now knew, that he had likely paid for. Jin was sitting up, his back against the damp concrete wall. He looked less like a dying man and more like a fallen king, his face a pale mask of exhaustion and sharp, lethal angles. He watched her move, his dark eyes tracking the way she meticulously cleaned her instruments. She didn't look at him. She couldn't. To look at him was to acknowledge the collapse of her own independence. "You should be sleeping," she said, her voice clinical and brittle. "Your pulse is still irregular." "I've had worse," he rasped. His voice was a low, fractured sound that seemed to scrape against the silence. "And I've had better doctors. But none as angry as you." Maya stopped, her hand tightening around a pair of forceps. She finally turned, her gaze locking onto his. "Angry. I've spent 3 years thinking I was the one keeping my family afloat. I've worked 80-hour weeks until my bones ached, all while you were playing God with our lives from the shadows. You didn't just save us, Jin. You colonized our future." Jin didn't flinch. He leaned his head back against the wall, a ghost of a shadow passing over his features. "I didn't do it for your gratitude, Maya. And I didn't do it out of guilt." "Then why? My father was a nobody. We were nobodies. Why take 3 bullets for a man you were sent to kill?" The silence stretched, filled only by the rhythmic thrum of the storm. Jin looked toward the small window, where the blurred lights of the city flickered in the downpour. "I was assigned to clear the block," he said, the words coming out slow and cold. "Your father was a witness to a transaction he wasn't supposed to see. My orders were absolute. Clean slate. No loose ends." Maya felt the air leave her lungs. She had always told herself it was a random robbery, a stray moment of street violence. To hear it was a sanctioned execution made the world feel suddenly, terrifyingly small. "I sat in the rain outside your apartment for 3 nights, Jin continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I watched you. I watched you walk Naomi to school before your shift. I watched you carry your mother up those stairs when the elevator broke. I watched you count out coins at the bodega just to buy her the good tea." He turned his head back to her, his gaze unblinking. "I had a silencer in my hand and a target on your father's chest. But I saw your resilience. I saw the way you held that house together with nothing but sheer, stubborn will. I realized that if I pulled the trigger, I wouldn't just be killing a man. I'd be extinguishing the only light in that godforsaken neighborhood." "So you betrayed them," Maya whispered. "I stepped into the line of fire," Jin corrected. "I made sure the hit went wrong. I let them think I was dead, and then I used what resources I had left to make sure you never had to count coins again. It wasn't about guilt. It was about seeing something worth saving and deciding, for once in my life, that the orders didn't matter." He reached out, his hand hovering near hers on the metal tray, but he didn't touch her. The electric tension from the night before was back, but now it was laced with a profound, terrifying vulnerability. "You think you're the only one who survived that night, Maya," he said softly. But I've been living in your shadow for 3 years. I didn't just watch over your family. I watched you. And I stayed because I couldn't remember what it was like to be around someone who didn't know how to give up. Maya looked at his scarred shoulder, then at the hard, honest line of his mouth. The anger was still there, but it was being crowded out by a realization that felt like a bridge collapsing. She wasn't just his project, he was her witness. And in the cold, wet dark of the basement, she realized that the most frightening thing wasn't that he had been watching her, but that he had seen her more clearly than she had ever seen herself. The fluorescent hum of St. Jude's felt sharper than usual, a serrated edge cutting through the exhaustion that had become Maya's second skin. She moved through the corridors with a calculated rhythm, her mind split between the trauma bay and the basement miles away where Jin lay recovering. She was a professional at compartmentalization, but today, the walls were sweating. The air in the hospital had changed. It was no longer just the smell of antiseptic and old grief, but the metallic tang of an approaching storm. It started with a black sedan, not the one she had been forced into, but another, parked with an aggressive lack of pretense in the ambulance bay. Then came the man in the lobby, dressed in a suit too expensive for a Tuesday morning, watching the nursing station with the predatory patience of a hawk. Maya felt the back of her neck prickle. They hadn't found the basement yet, but they had found her. They had run the math and realized that the ghost they were hunting had a tether, and that tether wore navy scrubs and a name tag. Maya, you've got to consult in room 4, a senior nurse called out, but the voice sounded distant, muffled by the roar of blood in Maya's ears. She checked her phone beneath the desk. A text from Naomi. A nice man in a suit came by the apartment. Said he was a friend of yours from the hospital. Did you forget your keys? The world tilted. Maya's grip on her clipboard tightened until the plastic groaned. The chessboard had been laid out while she was busy checking vitals, and her family was currently the most vulnerable pieces on the board. She couldn't call the police. To involve the law was to sign Jin's death warrant and reveal the illegal surgery that would cost her everything. She had to play the game within the shadows they provided. She ducked into a supply closet, the darkness smelling of latex and linen. Her breath came in jagged shudders. She dialed the burner phone Jin had pressed into her hand. "They're at the house," she whispered the moment he picked up. "And they're here, at the hospital." "Maya, listen to me." Jin's voice was a low, fractured rasp, but the command in it was absolute. "They won't touch them yet. You are the only lead they have to my location. They need you to break. Do not go home. I can't just leave them there." "My people are already moving," he said, and the conviction in his tone was the only thing keeping her upright. "If you move toward the apartment, you lead the hunters to the nest. Stay in the light. Stay where there are cameras. Be the nurse they expect you to be." Maya stepped back into the hallway, her face a mask of clinical indifference that hid a screaming heart. She spent the next 4 hours moving through the hospital like a ghost, aware of every suit in the hallway, every lingering gaze in the cafeteria. She used the hospital's labyrinthine layout to her advantage, ducking through service elevators and laundry chutes to send frantic, coded instructions to her mother via a secure app Jin had installed. The hospital was no longer a sanctuary of healing, it was a cage. Every time the double doors hissed open, she expected a blade or a badge. She found herself checking the oxygen tanks, not for levels, but as potential weapons. She watched the security monitors, mapping the blind spots where a man could be taken without a sound. By the end of her shift, the man in the lobby was gone, but the charcoal sedan remained, a silent promise of what was to come. Maya stood at the exit, her bag heavy on her shoulder, looking out at the rain-slicked pavement. She was a woman who had spent her life avoiding debt, yet she was now deep in a war she hadn't declared, protecting a man who had stolen her independence only to replace it with a terrifying, lethal kind of belonging. She took a breath, adjusted her collar, and stepped out into the rain. The game had moved beyond the hospital walls, and for the first time in her life, Maya wasn't just saving a patient, she was playing for the king. The rain had turned the city into a blurred reflection of itself by the time Maya returned to the basement. She didn't go to the medical tray first. She didn't check the dressings or the four-drip. She stood in the center of the room, her navy scrubs darkened by the damp, and watched Jin. He was sitting on the edge of the cot, jaw tight as he struggled to pull a clean shirt over his bandaged shoulder. The vulnerability of the movement, the way his strength faltered for a fraction of a second, only made her anger feel more like a physical ache. "You had no right," she said, her voice dropping into the low, dangerous register of a woman who had finally been pushed too far. Jin didn't look up. "I had every right. I made a choice 3 years ago. I lived with the consequences of it. Part of that was ensuring the life I saved stayed saved." "No," Maya stepped into the circle of amber light, her shadow stretching long and jagged against the brick. "You didn't just save a life. You orchestrated a play. You've been her silent escort." Naomi mentioned a nice man who watched her walk home from the library. "That was you. The money for my mother's specialists, the way our landlord stopped being a predator and started being a ghost, it was all you. You didn't just watch over us. You took my place. You took the only thing I had that was actually mine, the fact that I was the one taking care of them." Jin finally looked at her, his dark eyes reflecting the flickering lamp. There was no apology in his gaze, only a weary, absolute clarity. "I didn't take your place, Maya. I stood in the gap where you couldn't be. You are one woman. You work 12-hour shifts in a trauma ward while the men who want your father dead are still breathing. You wanted to handle it all alone because you're terrified of what happens when the shield isn't yours to hold." "I'm terrified of being a project," she snapped, her hands trembling. "I'm a nurse. I'm a daughter. I'm a sister. I am not a charity case for a mafia hitman who developed a conscience at the 11th hour. Every time I thought I was succeeding, every time I thought we were finally getting ahead because of my work, it was actually just you moving a chess piece. Do you have any idea how that feels? To realize your entire life is a gift from a stranger you didn't ask to know." "It wasn't a gift," Jin said, his voice rising for the first time, a rough, fractured sound. "It was a debt I owed to the world. I've spent 15 years taking things away. For 3 years, I tried to give one thing back. And I didn't watch Naomi because I wanted to play God. I watched her because the streets in this neighborhood don't care how hard you work at the hospital. They don't care about your pride. They only care about who is standing in the light." He stood up, the effort draining the color from his face, and took a single unsteady step toward her. He was close enough now that she could feel the heat radiating from his feverish skin. "You're so afraid of needing someone that you'd rather see them in danger than accept a hand you didn't earn," he whispered. "But the shield is heavy, Maya. It's too heavy for one person. I didn't stay because I wanted to manage you. I stayed because I couldn't look away from someone who was fighting the same monsters I was, just from a different side of the glass." Maya looked at him, and for the first time, the defensive wall she had spent her life building felt like a cage rather than a fortress. She saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the same exhaustion she saw in her own mirror every morning. She realized then that they were both just trying to keep the dark at bay, one with a needle and the other with a blade. The silence that followed wasn't the cold silence of the hospital. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of two people who had finally recognized each other in the dark. "I don't know how to do this," she whispered, her voice finally breaking. "I don't know how to not be the one in control." "You don't have to," Jin said, his hand hovering inches from hers, waiting for the permission he had never asked for until now. "You just have to let the shield be shared." The shift in the air was instantaneous, a sudden, violent departure from the heavy intimacy of their conversation. It wasn't a sound that alerted Maya, but the lack of it. The rhythmic thrum of the rain on the basement windows had been cut by the shadow of a body passing over the glass. Then came the soft, electronic chirp of Jin's burner phone, a frantic pulse in the dark. "They're here," Jin rasped, his hand finally closing over hers, not in a gesture of comfort, but to pull her down as the first window shattered. Glass rained down like diamonds onto the concrete floor. Maya didn't scream. The years of trauma bay sirens had conditioned her for the cold, clinical clarity of a crisis. She grabbed her medical bag, the straps biting into her shoulder, while Jin struggled to his feet, one hand clamped over his leaking wound. He was a king in ruins, but the lethal sharpness was back in his eyes. "The service tunnel behind the boiler," he commanded, his breath hitching. "Move, Maya. Now." The basement was no longer a sanctuary, it was a kill box. They moved into the narrow, damp throat of the maintenance tunnels, the smell of rust and stagnant water rising to meet them. Maya took the lead, her small penlight cutting a jagged path through the dark. She knew how to navigate the invisible arteries of a city, the basements, the laundry chutes, the supply corridors, better than any hunter. To the men in suits, she was a civilian, a non-entity. To the city, she was a ghost in navy scrubs. They emerged into a rain-slicked alley 3 blocks away, where a nondescript delivery van sat idling, its back doors ajar. Jin collapsed against the metal siding, his face the color of ash. Maya didn't hesitate. She shoved him into the back among the crates of medical supplies she had pilfered from St. Jude's. "I'm driving," she said, her voice a steel blade. "Maya, you can't." "I'm the only one who doesn't look like a target," she snapped, slamming the doors. She climbed into the driver's seat, her hand steady on the wheel. In the rearview mirror, she saw a charcoal sedan turn the corner, its headlights swinging through the rain like searchlights. She didn't speed. Speed drew the eye. Instead, she moved with the practiced, invisible flow of an ambulance driver navigating a city in cardiac arrest. She took the narrowest side streets, the ones the GPS ignored, using the invisible status of a service vehicle to blend into the city's early morning pulse. Behind her, she could hear Jin's ragged breathing, a wet sound that told her the internal sutures were fraying. "Talk to me, Jin," she called out, her eyes darting between the mirror and the road. "Stay with me." "Still here," he whispered, the sound faint against the rattle of the van. "You're better at this than you should be." "I've spent my life avoiding being seen," she replied, cutting through a dark industrial lot. "You're just finally noticing the benefit." As they neared the secondary safe house, a derelict clinic on the edge of the docks, the charcoal sedan reappeared in her mirror, closing the gap. Maya's grip tightened. She didn't have a weapon, but she had a 3-ton van and a map of the city's dead ends burned into her brain. She took a sharp, screeching turn into a narrow alleyway intended for garbage trucks, the side mirrors clipping the brick walls. She killed the lights and rolled to a stop behind a row of overflowing dumpsters. The sedan roared past the mouth of the alley, its occupants blinded by their own predatory focus. Maya sat in the dark, the engine ticking as it cooled. Her heart was a frantic drum, but her hands were still. She climbed into the back, her penlight finding Jin's face. He was conscious, but barely, the bandage over his shoulder blooming with fresh, brilliant red. She didn't ask for permission this time. She reached for the hemostat and the gauze, her movements a blur of clinical precision. In the high-speed silence of the van, the roles had finally inverted. He was the ward, and she was the guardian. As she worked to stabilize the man who had spent 3 years guarding her, Maya realized that the extraction wasn't just about moving a body through a city. It was about moving herself out of the shadow. She wasn't just saving a patient, she was claiming her place in the war. The derelict clinic at the docks smelled of brine and old rust, a cold, hollow shell that felt like the end of the world. Outside, the cranes loomed like skeletal giants against the grey dawn, but inside, the space was reduced to the small, flickering radius of a single battery-powered lantern. Maya sat on a low stool, her hands finally still after hours of fighting the hemorrhage. Jin lay back against a pile of shipping blankets, his breathing shallow but steady, the color beginning to seep back into his hollowed cheeks. The silence here was different from the basement. It wasn't the silence of hiding. It was the heavy, exhausted quiet that follows a surrender. Maya watched the rise and fall of his chest, her eyes tracing the line of his jaw. She felt the weight of her own exhaustion, a bone-deep ache that made her defensive walls feel impossible to hold up any longer. "You could have gone," she said, her voice a soft, fractured thread in the dark. "With your resources, with the way you move, you could have disappeared years ago. Why are you still in this city, Jin? Why are you still living in the dirt?" Jin opened his eyes, the obsidian depth of them softened by the lantern's amber glow. He didn't look at the boarded-up windows or the door he was supposed to be guarding. He looked only at her. "I tried to leave," he whispered, the words sounding like a confession. 6 months after the shooting, I had a passport and a clean trail. I was at the station." He paused, a ghost of a smile touching his lips, expression so rare it looked painful. "Then I thought about the way you look when you're angry at a broken elevator. I thought about the way Naomi hums when she's studying. I realized that if I left, the shield would go with me. And the men I worked for, They don't forget witnesses. They only wait for the protection to lapse. You stayed for us, Maya realized, the gravity of it pressing into her lungs. You stayed in a life you hated, surrounded by people who want you dead, just to be a shadow on our street. I stayed because you were the only thing that made sense in a world that didn't, Jin said, his voice dropping to a low, rough vibration. For 15 years, my life was defined by what I destroyed. But when I looked at your house, I saw something being built. I saw someone who refused to let the city win. I stayed because as long as I was watching you, I wasn't a ghost. I was a man with a purpose. He reached out, his fingers brushing the hem of her navy scrub sleeve. This time, Maya didn't pull away. She leaned into the contact, her hand finding his. His skin was cool, his grip weak, but the connection felt like a live wire. In the clinical, sterile world of her hospital, Maya dealt with life and death every hour, but she had never felt as vital, as terrifyingly alive, as she did in this rotting clinic. She looked at him and saw the truth he hadn't been able to say until the blood started to run out. She wasn't just his project, and he wasn't just her guardian. She was the anchor that kept him from drifting into the absolute dark. She was his only tie to a world where names mattered and wounds healed. "You're a fool," she whispered, her eyes stinging as she squeezed his hand. "Probably," Jin admitted, his eyes fluttering shut as sleep finally began to claim him. "But I'm a fool who's still here." Maya sat with him as the sun began to hit the docks, the orange light bleeding through the cracks in the boards. She realized that the independence she had cherished was a lonely kind of freedom. To be needed by a man like Jin was a different kind of weight, heavy, dangerous, and entirely permanent. She didn't let go of his hand. She stayed in the light, watching over the man who had spent 3 years watching over her, finally understanding that some debts aren't meant to be paid. They are meant to be lived. The final move on the board didn't happen in a basement or a back alley, but in the sharp, unforgiving clarity of the docks at sunrise. The men in the charcoal sedan had finally tracked the van's heat signature, their headlights cutting through the morning mist like the eyes of deep-sea predators. Maya stood outside the derelict clinic, her navy scrubs rumpled and stained, but her posture was a rigid line of defiance. She wasn't hiding anymore. She wasn't a ghost, and she wasn't a project. She was the barrier. When the lead man stepped out, a silhouette of tailored silk and cold intent, he didn't look at her. He looked past her, toward the door where Jin lay. "Move aside, nurse," he said, his voice a bored drawl. "This isn't your war." "You're wrong," Maya replied, her voice steady, carrying a weight that made the man pause. She didn't have a gun, but she held a small, black remote detonator Jin had given her, a failsafe for the clinic's localized gas lines. "I've spent 3 years in the trauma ward watching the wreckage men like you leave behind. I'm done cleaning up the mess. If you take another step, I'm not saving anyone today. I'm just finishing what you started." From the shadows of the doorway, Jin appeared. He was leaning heavily on a metal crate, his face pale, but he held a weapon with a hand that no longer trembled. He wasn't the guardian anymore, and she wasn't the ward. They were two halves of a single, jagged shield. He looked at Maya, not with the protective distance of a benefactor, but with the raw, terrifying respect of an equal. "She's right," Jin rasped, the cold air catching in his lungs. "The hit failed 3 years ago because I chose to see her. It fails today because she chose to see me. You can't kill a ghost that's finally stepped into the light." The standoff lasted for a heartbeat that felt like an eternity, the orange sun finally breaking over the horizon and washing the docks in a brilliant, blinding gold. In that light, the men in the suits looked small, their power revealed as nothing more than a shadow that couldn't survive the day. The lead man looked at the detonator in Maya's hand, then at the lethal certainty in Jin's eyes. He saw a debt that had been settled and a new, more dangerous alliance formed. Without a word, he signaled his men back into the car. The sedan reversed, its tires screaming on the wet asphalt, and vanished into the city's awakening roar. Maya let out a breath she felt she'd been holding for 3 years. The detonator slipped from her fingers, clattering onto the concrete. She didn't collapse. She turned to Jin, who was watching her with an expression that was no longer guarded. The silence between them was finally clean. "You're unemployed," he said softly, a genuine smile finally breaking the mask of his face. I've already got a new job, Maya replied, stepping toward him and letting him lean his weight against her shoulder. It's a partnership. High risk, no benefits, and the boss is incredibly difficult. I heard the pay is terrible, Jin murmured, his head resting against hers as they began to walk toward the edge of the docks, away from the shadows and into the heat of the rising sun. I don't care about the pay, Maya said, her hand locking firmly with his. I'm done counting coins. I'm just ready to start the story. As they stepped out onto the main road, the city of Seoul began to hum around them, a vast, indifferent machine that no longer felt like a cage. They moved together, two survivors who had traded a lie for a truth, finally walking into a world where the light belonged to both of them. The shield was no longer heavy, it was shared. And for the first time in her life, Maya didn't look back to see who was watching. She knew he was right beside her.